Good afternoon. I'm Bethany Saxon, the Director of Communications at the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University. Thank you for joining us for this webinar where we will explore the impact of just cause eviction laws in Kansas City and beyond. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We'd like to quickly acknowledge that the project presenter here was supported by the CDC and Change Lab Solutions, and that the views expressed here do not reflect the official policies of the U.S. government. Our presenters today will spend time at the end of the webinar answering questions. Please feel free to send questions as you may think of them throughout the webinar. To submit a question, open the Q&A panel using the ellipsis button on the bottom of your screen and select Q&A. Once the panel is open, select All Panelists. You may then type your question and click Send. Our moderator today is Tara Ramanathan Holiday. Tara is the team lead for the CDC Public Health Law program. Tara, I'll now hand this over to you.
Hi, Bethany. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Excellent. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm going to introduce first our panelists and then jump into sort of the background. So we'll first hear from Elizabeth Walsh from Kansas City, Missouri, who is a public health statistician in the health department there. We will then move to Bill Snook, who is the Senior Information and Policy Officer for Kansas City, Missouri's Health Department. And we will finally hear from Javon Davis, who is the Assistant Deputy Commissioner in Philadelphia's Fire Department. And we'll hear about the work that Kansas City has really been doing in terms of systematic legal research and policy research to achieve some very interesting programmatic outcomes. This process is really depicted here. So CDC's policy process is designed to show how we can better understand and use law and policy to achieve certain outcomes. And so as a little background about why we are highlighting this project and our esteemed colleagues from Kansas City, we really want to know sort of how we can better innovate and improve in the field of public health practice. As we all know, the purpose of policy is really to fashion strategies for solving public problems. And because of our system of federalism, state and local legislators, as well as administrative agencies that run health and affiliated programs, they're really fundamental to writing down rules about structures and interventions that make public health governance happen. For example, there are myriad examples of state or local government taking actions to standardize or guide activities that impact public health and codify them into a statute or regulation. So here we see each of these domains of this process that are depicted as really being impactful, but also impacted by the use of data and evidence about what works and what doesn't in public health practice. There is actually a whole field of work devoted to developing that kind of evidence on the use of public health law and policy. So legal epidemiology, shown here, is the scientific study of law as a factor in the cause, distribution, and prevention of disease and injury in a population. There are many kinds of legal epi studies, including the one that you're going to hear about shortly from Kansas City, but these generally take the approaches of legal mapping and sometimes more advanced quantitative or qualitative research. Kansas City's work highlights the use of policy surveillance to understand how laws change over time. This type of information, coupled with public health surveillance data, can really help us analyze policy options, and we can then begin to rate, prioritize, and evaluate those options, and most importantly, communicate about them to the public. So this work, I have to mention, is part of a national initiative to move public health law research, specifically the tools of legal epidemiology, into the domain of public health practice. CDC developed a multi-year investment in public health law capacity in state, tribal, local, and territorial jurisdictions, which we call STILPs, that aims to institutionalize and support the use of law and policy to improve health outcomes in the field. So this cooperative agreement DC Center for State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support has funded the Public Health Law Academy and the Legal Epidemiology Center, which have been developed through our partners here, Change Lab Solutions and Temple University's Policy Surveillance Program and its Center for Public Health Law Research. Together with Kansas City, we and other jurisdictions, we have actually developed what we call the Snook Legal Epidemiology Project, which is work with different jurisdictions, first 9 localities in 2016, and now in 2018 and 2019, 6 state, local, and tribal partners to better understand and use legal research, specifically policy surveillance, to address issues and gaps in public health programs and health outcomes. So with that, let's get started and hear about how Kansas City, Missouri's experience really resulted in a truly innovative policy surveillance study on housing policy. I will turn the mic over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Tara. We're just going to talk to you about our project that we did in collaboration with Temple and of policy surveillance of just cause, eviction, and retaliation laws. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a geographic context because Kansas City, Missouri lies within a unique geography, and therefore we also have a unique legal context. Our city spans 4 counties and is also part of a bi-state metropolitan area. While we are subject mainly to the city, the state of Missouri, and federal laws, we often consider what other cities, counties, and our neighboring state of Kansas has for laws. After all, no one lives in a bubble. And I want to note that while there is also a Kansas City, Kansas, when we say Kansas City during this presentation, we are referring to Kansas City, Missouri, which you can see outlined here in heavy black. In 2017, a researcher out of Chicago, whose hometown is Kansas City, began to look at eviction cases for Jackson County, Missouri, of which Kansas City composes about 40%. They found, on average, 42 evictions filed in Jackson County Court each business day. This, of course, excludes any illegal evictions that take place outside of the court system. In Missouri, landlords cannot remove a tenant from a property without a court order. About 80% of the properties listed in the eviction data had a history of at least one other eviction within the previous 10 years, and the top 100 properties accounted for 10% of all eviction cases filed. The highest eviction neighborhoods for Jackson County are part of Kansas City, Missouri, where the average median income is around $30,000 a year compared to the citywide median income of just under $50,000 per year. The high rate of evictions is a serious public health issue because evictions impact access to schools and transportation, as well as job stability, and negatively impacts one's physical and mental health. Since we know that the largest public health impacts happen at the policy level, we sought to understand how other local jurisdictions protected tenants from evictions, especially among our most vulnerable populations. Our project involves policy surveillance of local just cause eviction, tenant harassment, and tenant retaliation protection laws. Policy surveillance tracks laws and policies over time and across jurisdictions, as Tara mentioned earlier. It uses a rigorous scientific process to create data for evaluation and empirical research. Here we show an overview of the process, which is purposefully displayed as circular as opposed to linear. At the center of the process is quality control, as the entire process is iterative, where one goes back and refines through each step. And for some odd reason, I forgot to include a slide specifically on the first step, which is defining the scope, so I do apologize for that. But scoping involves identifying the topic and parameters for the project. So we look to answer questions about whether local jurisdictions had just cause eviction protection laws, what types of evictions would fall under quote-unquote just cause, and whether related laws such as tenant harassment or retaliation protections existed in conjunction with the just cause eviction laws. We determined that our audience for this project would be health department and city stakeholders. And finally, we decided to do a cross-sectional study rather than a longitudinal study. So we looked at what laws were in place at a current point in time. The second step in policy surveillance involves background research. Here, we investigated the legal landscape to identify key elements of the law to help us define preliminary constructs for the rest of the project. The first part of background research involved creating a background memorandum using reliable secondary sources. So secondary sources in the context of policy surveillance involve sources other than the law itself, things such as articles, books, websites, and reliable websites, not like the conspiracy theory ones, and legal data sets. So using these sources, we had two researchers summarize the current state of law in two different sets of 5 jurisdictions. And in the background memos, we explored the legal landscape of just cause evictions and related laws, identified sources of the law, the structure of the law, and any variations of the law. Remember that this process is iterative, so we developed background memos. As we developed the background memos, we also went back and refined our scope as necessary. We also documented our search strategy, which included our scoping decisions, search term used, and other key information, so that if anybody wanted to replicate the work that we did, they'd be able to. And then finally, we generated a list of preliminary list of constructs, which we used in our next step, question development. So question development allows us to track laws through a question and answer format. This generates empirical data that can be used for evaluation purposes. The questions we generate had to measure the law rather than interpret it, which isn't always easy because we are all in the habit of interpreting the law or trying to determine what it could mean. But writing the questions and answers in a right way can help yield clear responses that can be consistently collected by different researchers. So that part was really, really important for the whole project. After we reviewed the law, we finalized our constructs, turned those constructs into questions. And the types of questions that we wrote were either yes, no, questions where only one response applied, or questions where multiple responses could apply. And as I previously said, this is an iterative process. So during this whole time, we were going back and refining questions and answers as we went through the law and captured unexpected responses. And I will turn this over to Javon.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome. I'm going to try and pass this to you.
Perfect. I think I have it now.
Okay.
As mentioned before, my name is Javon Davis. I am currently with the City of Philadelphia, but before this is fairly new, I worked for the City of Kansas City, Missouri Health Department, where we worked on issues just like these. And I'm really happy to re-engage because it's such an impactful project that I am excited to share with you all. So the next step was really, getting into the weeds and collecting the law. Similar to the first part of the process, we broke down into 2 different researchers, Elizabeth and I typically, and started at those steps, which were identifying the relevant laws based on what we found in our question development step. We went with, just cause for eviction, whether or not written notice was needed or necessary in each of the jurisdictions, and whether or not there were retaliation protections. So those are the kind of laws we were looking for as we went through each of the cities. Next, of course, we're recording the citations, so the relevant text from either, we specifically looked at local, but we found sometime that state law would also have an impact, so we would code that on master sheet as well. So for every jurisdiction, we had a list of bulleted municipal codes and sections that are relevant to the issues of eviction. From there, we collected the individual laws and make sure we had them organized into different folders. So if we want to go back and look for only at the just cause evictions, we could find them fairly easily without, having to research for things, and then creating legal text based on those. So I think the most important step here was just staying organized, because we saw so many different code sections that could have easily been lost, but the process really helps guide you to a place of organization where you can just easily refer to your master sheet and know where to go for San Diego's section about housing and where in that section you can find the just cause eviction, which is helpful for someone like me who typically isn't very organized when I'm doing research. So having, learned this process, I think it's really beneficial moving forward that I can now have a structure for doing so. So we both did that, and then we would come together. So several meetings, Elizabeth would say, okay, we're going to do Boston, San Jose, Seattle, San Diego, and San Francisco today. The first half of the day will be individual. We won't talk about it at all to keep it, for the quality control, and then we'll come together and sit down, and you say Elizabeth would have just cause for this issue, but I wouldn't have it, then we'll discuss why I did not pick that and go from there. But I'll get into more of that in a second. So the cities we chose were Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego, New Orleans, Chicago, New York, and Boston. We wanted to look all over the country and see what was happening, and we chose these cities because we found like they had some of the strongest laws for protecting tenants, and we wanted to see what about them made them different from what we had and what other cities had. So as you see, a lot of them are in California, but we felt that those were great cities to use because they had such great protections on the books. So then we came to the coding step. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, this is done in a question and answer format. So if you look in the bottom right corner, you'll see, does the law require just cause for eviction? Well, yes. And then the next step, well, for which issue? So failure to pay rent, violation of lease, we had a whole list of different sections that we can go through. And that makes it actually really great on the back end of the project, where you can go in and if you're looking for language for a landlord occupancy, which I didn't really even know about until, going through this project, you can look at that and see what it's like if a landlord wanted to move into their own, rental property. What are the steps for that, opposed to having to search through? It makes it very clean and clear. So even for this step too, if, like I said, if we had a difference in what we thought the law was saying or the section was saying, that we would come together afterwards and do that. So that was the redundant coding part by the jurisdiction. The monocle application made it very easy and smooth to do so, and I think, again, it helped us with our organization. But again, the best part is like the organization and also the collaboration it takes to come together and say, well, you chose refusal to access the unit, but I didn't. And then we would both look at the law together and come to an agreement before we moved on to the master sheet and have the final product. So results, we get a map like this. So as I said, it's an interactive platform, so you can, if you were looking for retaliation protections, you know that Chicago or San Jose or San Francisco or Seattle would be a place to go, and New Orleans as well. But you wouldn't have to waste time by going through all these cities to look for that. So we found that all of the cities we chose had just cause for eviction protections, but not all of them had retaliation protections. So that again could be like a place for growth or a place for a change that could be of impact. You can visually see which cities are lacking in that, which I felt was visually very important and very helpful. If you're looking to do some work like this, this could be a great resource for doing that. So overall, we found that all the jurisdictions require a landlord must have just cause before attempting to issue an eviction. 9 of them require written notice before an eviction or termination of a lease, and 5 had protections for tenants from retaliation and landlords. So the challenges here is just a big part of the process, which I think was actually, maybe I'm a nerd, but I felt fairly excited about it. It was actually going through each of the municipal codes and seeing how the law was written and what that meant for the outcome for the tenant protections. So, getting into the weeds, it kind of gets confusing, and sometimes you don't really understand, but I would say the CDC team was extremely helpful if we had a question for what an effective date meant, and if it was still in effect today, how does the state law interact with the local code. They were extremely helpful with that, but it's still a challenge as someone who started off, not really knowledgeable on the process or not really knowledgeable on how to navigate municipal code. This project really helped me grow in that area, and as someone who works in local government, I think that's a really important skill to have, just basic understanding of how they are sectioned off and broken down. So we did find that Oregon did have a very robust state protection law, so it seemed at times that the local code didn't have enough, but when in reality they were protected because of state codes. Same thing happened in New York. But again, the CDC team was really helpful in helping us through navigating those issues. And of course, we were looking at not just calls for eviction, we were looking for retaliation and protections too. So we just added another layer to our project. And then, how do we measure the effectiveness versus, calls of implementation and interpretation of each of the new laws we were thinking about. I think as I said earlier, a few of the clear takeaways were really understanding what it meant to have this municipal code on the books, how it impacted people, and seeing the language. I learned so much I didn't know that there were protections for people who wanted to make their rental house into a condo. There were just lots of different things that we learned looking through this that made me realize that there's a deeper, our municipal codes are so complex, but what that means looking at the other side. And again, we could use these skills in any of our work if we're doing policy-based work. Very easily you can go to look at other cities and kind of steal language from somewhere else and use it in your place. And you don't have to do a whole lot of work because a lot of the language is going to be the same, and it was the same throughout the 10 cities that we saw. So it was just another tool to have available to you as a local government or academic or wherever you may be working. And I think the last takeaway really was, I think we get hard on ourselves as practitioners that we're doing something wrong because our community is facing this issue, but then looking through, we saw 10 cities and there are many more that are facing the same issue, as I'm sure we've seen in the news and how eviction is having a big moment right now. So it was really kind of just like, okay, everyone's having this problem. It's not just us. That was reassuring. And now I'm going to pass it over to Bill to talk about how they plan to use the project moving forward.
Thanks, John. So moving forward, we're looking at comparing the eviction trends when we estimate the potential impact for KCMO and then working with KC tenants. We're in an interesting moment in our Kansas City history because we're having an election today. And basically, we will be getting a new mayor, and based on the new mayor, we may or may not have the same city manager structure that we've had before. And we've also have a high turnover in our city council. So right now, we're preparing to see where we need to be going to serve those new needs that are going to be highlighted by the new mayor and the city council.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
I will also say it's very timely because throughout the last, year, all of the candidates for mayor and city council have really been talking a lot about affordable housing and the impact that has had on the city and the issues we're seeing with affordable housing. So that's a great complement and a dovetail to this eviction work. And I think if we position ourselves right, we can really leverage some of the work that we've done here into those discussions.
And we also are in the process of updating and consolidating all of the housing ordinances in Kansas City. Right now, that's a 400-page document. So when you look at the municipal code, as Javon and Elizabeth have alluded to, it can be very complex. It can have many different mountains and valleys and streams and backdoors and caves that you have to find. So having this skill set helps provide a better opportunity to navigate discussions when you're working with and providing education to elected officials and community-based organizations. So another future policy surveillance project could be the decriminalization laws or the school discipline policies. In Kansas City, the statistical team did analyses of school discipline and suspension rates, even for elementary students. And they were disproportionately associated with a certain race or class. So when that was brought to the administrator's attention, they took a really hard look at the way they are applying their school discipline and to make sure that it's fair and equitable, and it's applied judiciously and appropriately across all students. And then we also have the considerations for the Community Health Improvement Plan. We do have a Community Health Improvement Plan. It's undergoing a review right now for next year. So things that could be in that plan would be more healthy homes inspections. We just had a healthy homes inspection ordinance passed by the will of the people. In Kansas City, we do have petition initiatives where communities and local organizations can create policy and try to have it put onto the ballot if they have enough signatures. So we're working on multiple levels and multiple areas of influence and education on the laws that we're seeing. So from the communication side, this data is important to have because it actually creates some of the talking points that can steer the communication to better policy. And with that, I will turn it back to Elizabeth.
And that's all we have. We know it's a bit short, but we like to get short and sweet and to the point. So Tara and Bethany, we're ready for any questions that anyone might have.
This is Tara. Thank you so much for your thoughtful and just very comprehensive overview of the process and the project and the motivations behind what you did, as well as the sort of outcomes from that. Bethany, do you want to talk about the WebEx Q&A?
Sure, yeah. So at this time, you can go ahead and put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking the ellipsis button on the bottom of the screen and selecting Q&A. To add a question, you can select all panelists. You type it into the chat box that is underneath that, and then click send, and we should be able to see what you have to ask. Tara, while we wait, do you have a couple of questions that you might be able to ask to get us started?
Oh my gosh, always, yes. So the first thing that occurred to me while I was listening to you all is, you know, you were very thoughtful in how you talked about picking jurisdictions with sort of robust or, you know, impactful policies. And I wonder if you considered whether or not those jurisdictions would have similar types of governance structures or, you know, I guess entities or agencies involved in this sort of tenant protection process that would lend themselves particularly for comparison to yours, or whether they're sort of all over the place and that provided its own learning opportunity for you.
This is Elizabeth. They're sort of all over the place. We tried to find some cities that were really similar to Kansas City in their structure, and particularly some Midwest cities, but we had a really hard time finding any. So a lot of that's why, like, California was really robust, and we felt like, well, if we can't find cities that are similar to us, we could at least find cities where we could learn a lot from. We found one thing I found, Boston is like really, really unique in that their city passes a piece of legislation, but then the state has to ratify it. So Boston had already passed their just cause eviction, but the state had yet to ratify it. So we really struggled on whether or not, like, okay, well, the city clearly wants it, but technically it's not legal. So how do we code that? Can we code that? So that was a really interesting difference that we found, and definitely like something that if our city ever wanted to go towards that, we would protest very loudly. So that, yes, but it was really interesting to learn about the different cities and how they're structured and how their policy process works.
Yeah, I remember.
Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I remember we were searching and looking through every city we could imagine that, and then being disappointed when they didn't have any protections at all on the book, especially in the Midwest. So we were really surprised by that. And then, as Elizabeth said, we were, if we're going to do it, might as well go for the best if we want to learn where the best place to benchmark and where to learn from. That's why we ended up doing the way we did. But we were surprised at how few cities had protections for just cause and other things on the books.
And when you say that they were the best, did you look at their sort of eviction data, or were you actually just looking at the policy and seeing how comprehensive it was?
We were looking through their local municipal code mostly. So we were looking for, places that had these sorts of ordinances passed that were making an impact in that way.
Yeah. That's really interesting, and I love hearing about sort of why you picked certain comparison sites and what you got out of that. That's really awesome. When we do this work, we often kind of ask this without having any particular expectation, but have you figured out how you want to communicate to different stakeholders or groups or even other jurisdictions, the county or the state, whatever it might be, the counties in your case, about this type of data and what it means for both the rates that you have as well as sort of the ways that you want to approach tackling this issue? Or have the communication have you been waiting to figure that out until after the election and so on?
We've been waiting until after the election. We were doing this project while we were also trying to pass our Healthy Homes, our rental inspection program. So we didn't want to be too vocal because the Healthy Homes program had a lot of resistance from area landlords because they thought it would be it was just a method to punish them or take more money from them or whatnot. So definitely this is something that we've sort of kept in our pocket, but once we have our new mayor and city council, we definitely can work through that strategy.
No, that's great, and the communicating of it and the strategy behind communicating, I think, could be its own analysis and its own project sometimes. So
For sure.
That's really interesting to hear, and sort of interesting to hear about the process and how this works in real life and in real time.
Tara, it looks like we have a question from someone in the audience.
Yes, and I'm actually, Bethany, I'm not able to see the whole question for some reason. Would you be able to read it out?
It says, methodologically, can you expand on the concept of measuring the law rather than interpreting it?
Sure. So one of the things that when we're writing the questions and we're going to answer it as we're coding the law, we had to look at the question and then just ask ourselves whether or not the law itself said that. So whereas you could look at a law, and I'm trying to think of an example. I think Jovan and I went back and forth a lot of this on some of the just cause reasons. But is that something where it's written out in black and white, that is measuring the law? Or is it well, if I read it this way, then this would apply. So that would be interpreting the law. So we were just trying to do the first one. And it was really, really hard sometimes to not try to interpret it and be well, no, in this context, that's totally what it would mean. But that's not measuring the law. That is interpreting it, which is something different. And everybody can, there's tons of lawyers and judges that can interpret a law differently, right? We have a Supreme Court that's never 100% on something. So that's sort of the difference.
Yeah, I remember specifically we would go back and forth a lot about the written notice terms or the retaliation protections, a tenant cannot be approached by a landlord for 20 days or something, and we had our questions coded in a way that would mean that they didn't really protect them if it only protected for 20 days. We went back and forth about what that meant for long-term, or if a long-term or broader statement actually meant protection for life, or, we went back and forth a lot about how that would happen and what that meant for the jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
I think I see Alex has a question. In the broader domain of policy surveillance, how does one measure enforcement?
I think that's a question for you, Tara. I have no idea.
Tara, I can take a stab at it after you,
yes,
if you need help.
I was going to say, so we all have different approaches to understanding sort of how the law works in practice. Sometimes it flew by one of the slides at the beginning, which was different types of legal epi studies, and some of the sort of the measurement of enforcement and how it actually works. Sometimes we find that out through qualitative research, meaning we ask the people who are, thank you, Bethany, that's the slide. So we ask on the right side there, how does the law have impacts on sort of how you're actually seeing your program work, or who actually goes out and does the code enforcement, or who actually it has the authority and the responsibility for deciding whether or not an eviction is correctly done, I guess, either the process or the substantive reason behind it. So you can use that sort of qualitative research methodology to figure that out. You can also look at quantitative data if you have it, in terms of how many inspectors go out, how many people are figuring out whether or not, is it constructive eviction where people are changing locks, or is it, actual eviction where there's a notice tacked to your door. So there's different ways to kind of look at that, and the quantitative side really depends on the data that you have. Bethany, do you have a clearer answer than that?
No, I mean, I think that's about right. I think we don't tend to think about enforcement in terms of measurement through policy surveillance. We tend to think about it more in terms of using policy surveillance to identify the laws, and then using other legal epidemiology methods to then determine implementation and enforcement. I think maybe that's sort of the more concise way of describing it. Policy surveillance essentially is creating data. It's a tool to create data about the content in laws, not necessarily about to provide information about how they're implemented or enforced.
And I was going to say, there are people who do studies apart from the ones I showed you here. This is sort of what our range is in government, honestly, because this is, we don't apply the law differently to different populations. We, are bound by, it's like, I guess, responsible ethics for a lot of these things. And not to say that folks who do other kinds of studies aren't. It's just people sometimes in academia have the latitude to be able to do almost randomized controlled trial type studies on different populations that are getting different kinds of treatment based on the law. So the types of enforcement and the opportunities that the kinds of research that are not listed here, the type of research designs that are not listed here, have for understanding more about the factors that play into enforcement, the socioeconomic factors, and so on. Those are huge, and I think there are people out there studying how enforcement plays out for different kinds of interventions, or different kinds of systematic or systemic structures and so on, things like the criminal justice system, I know. So just to do a plug there for things which don't exactly fit on this slide, but are probably out there.
I will add one more thing that I just sort of thought of as you were saying that, Tara, is we've worked with a couple of groups who are interested in tracking, they're doing policy surveillance and they're tracking laws and policies, but they also are tracking like attorneys general opinions and court cases that may impact the way that laws are being implemented or enforced. So the example there is our abortion law project, which we've worked on with a number of other major research groups like Guttmacher and RAD and Answer and a few others. And the researchers that we've worked with from our team and from the subject matter experts who've helped design that project, they were interested in understanding the fact that law on the books is often different than law on the street, and that the combination, particularly with reproductive health and abortion rights specifically, the combination of the action by courts and the law changes the way that these laws are implemented and how they actually do impact people on the ground. So I think to answer that question, enforcement is one thing, implementation is another, and you can use policy surveillance more for implementation if you're starting to track things like court cases and attorneys general opinions and those sorts of things, but primarily we use it for laws and policies on the books. Are there any other questions? Tara, did you have anything else? Or Elizabeth, Javon, or Bill, did you have anything else that you wanted to make sure we covered?
No. I don't. But I did want to say thank you again so much to Elizabeth and Javon for slogging through the sort of analysis and for, hanging in there and what can be like a difficult process to see the end of when you're in the middle of it. And just thank you for your attention to detail and your thoughtfulness in approaching this work. And thank you to all three of you for agreeing to do this webinar and kind of get the word out there. That was really a wonderful, opportunity to kind of showcase a really cool data set. So.
Yeah, and we appreciate all of the, I know Andy is not here, but we appreciate all the technical support that we received, and it was a great learning experience, and like we said, it's a great addition to our toolbox.
Yes, we really couldn't do it without you all, because you guys answered a lot of our questions, and the guidance was so helpful. So I highly recommend it to anyone watching to check it out and try it out as well. It's a great tool to have and a great way to look at policy and evaluate your needs of your community.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, guys. We really appreciate your time and all the work that you've done to create this resource. We'll go ahead and end. If there are any questions beyond, you can reach out to us at lawatlas@temple.edu, or I think there's a way to reply using the registration information that you had when you signed up for this webinar. Thank you so much again for joining us.